Welcome to Eagles, Globes, and Anchors, the strategically minded podcast of Marine Corps University. Today we're discussing one of the books on the Commandant's professional reading list, A New Conception of War, John Boyd, the U.S. Marines, and Maneuver Warfare. My guest today is Maj Ian Brown, Operations Officer at the Krulak Center for Innovation and Future Warfare. He's a 53 pilot by trade, though he also holds military occupational specialties as a forward air controller and requirements officer. His operational experience includes deployments in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the Indo-PACOM region. Major Brown has written extensively on maneuver warfare, military history, and future war in articles for Marine Corps Gazette, Strategy Bridge, War on the Rocks, and MCU's own Journal of Advanced Military Studies. Major Brown is also the author of the book we're discussing today, A New Conception of War, John Boyd, the United States Marines, and Maneuver Warfare, published with Marine Corps University Press in 2018, and which was added to the most recent iteration of the Commandant's professional reading list. Major Brown, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Man, thank you very much. I'm very happy to have the chance to talk about my book, and I've long enjoyed the podcast, and it's a very august list of guests on there, and I'm very humbled to be joining that list.
Well, I got to tell you, Ian, we are so grateful to have had you as part of the MCU team for the past couple of years and see the work that you've done at the Krulak Center. There are people who are very good at writing books, who are intellectuals, but who are not always a joy to have around and have conversations with, and who maybe can't always be trusted to take an idea and turn it into action. But the work that you've done at the Krulak Center to really help stand that organization up and put it on the forefront of thinking within the Marine Corps and the broader DoD circles, you are not a one-trick pony. You have got some depth to you. So thank you, sir. We are delighted to have you on the team.
Yeah, appreciate that. And I have fully enjoyed everything that I've done there. It's been a great opportunity.
Good. So before we get into our discussion of the book itself, can you give our listeners some background on what led you to write A New Conception of War?
Absolutely. And kind of like I think I mentioned in in either the preface or the introduction, it was almost an accident, if you can call writing a book an accidental project. But it really it goes way back to when I was going through my master's at Norwich, and I had for the military thought and theory section, you had to write a short paper on the ideas of a military theorist. And I thought I'd get clever and try and punk my professor, who was he was a retired Canadian colonel of armor in Canada, and try and pick somebody who he hadn't heard of, or at least I would have thought he hadn't heard of, because most of the other students were civilians. They were all writing about Sun Tzu or Clausewitz or, some of the big names in military theory. And I was like, I don't really know much about Boyd, but as a Marine, I know, I remember he talked about him in MCDP1, and I've seen the OODA loop and some of the aviation tactics briefs I've seen. So I'll just go find out a little bit more. And, if I as a Marine don't know that much about Boyd, there's no way this retired Canadian colonel is going to know anything about it. And it totally backfired, because when I pitched him the paper, he was like, and he never used my name. He just called me Marine, because he just liked to treat his Marine students that way. But he was like, Marine, Boyd is one of my favorites. You better not screw it up. And I was like, whoops. So I wrote the paper with a little more trepidation about how it was going to turn out. But the paper turned into the genesis for my final thesis for the master's. And then my advisor, who was a former MCU guest professor several years back, suggested I pitch it over to the Marine Corps History magazine that was just standing up at that point. And this is about 2016, I want to say, thinking they'd be looking for new content for a new journal. So I took his recommendation. I did that, and I sent it over. And they came back and said that it, at about 90 pages, it was too long to be an article in their journal. And I was kind of like, sad face, but, I'll move on with my life. But then they also came back and said, but if you want to make it longer and turn it into a monograph, we will work with you to do that. I have zero experience in doing that, but I was just kind of like, why not? If you're willing to take it, I'll do some of the work. So they assigned me a fantastic editor, Angela Anderson, who was, she was there as the head of Marine Corps University Press and is still there. I really felt like they were rolling the dice on it. So I appreciated the risk they took, and I tried to turn back in a good product. And I don't know what the road is for writing a book, and I got to find out. But it was a fantastic experience. Their editors were all very helpful, and I'm extremely grateful that they were able to turn it into a book, which then a couple of years later was able to make it onto the reading list, which I certainly never expected going into it.
Well, I would say to our listeners, this is not a paid advertisement for Marine Corps University Press, although I think Ian has pointed out one of the things that we really value about the press, and that is their willingness to work with authors to help improve their writing, give constructive feedback, and really strengthen the research and the final product prior to publication.
The real value that I got from, I think, the press from taking a very uneven initial thesis is that they were able to help me kind of find and focus it to where it was, let's say, this is a me project, to something that could be of value to a much wider audience. And really, and in the process of it, they help sort of give it two aspects that I think make it useful for the broader audience of Marines. The first one was just telling a story that has not been, it's been told in pieces, but they're all kind of scattered all over the place. And there's not really a one-stop shop for like the story of how the Marine Corps, not other entities, adopted maneuver warfare as a doctrine in the late Cold War. So they were able to bring that focus to that and have a, what I hope is as much a one-stop shop about that story as you can find. And the other good thing that the process that McCup did was pushing me to find other material that hadn't been previously released to get the ideas of Boyd, as the central character, John Boyd, out into a wider audience, because the archives have all of his stuff, right? Air Force Colonel, but the Marine Corps Archives has all his stuff, which is a whole different story. But there's a tremendous amount of, a lot of people have written about Boyd, but the archives themselves, there's a huge amount of unused and untapped material there from his papers. So I wanted to, in the scope I had in the book, I wanted to get as much stuff out there as I could, because in starting all the way back when I tried to punk my professor, and then the whole process later on, I realized almost the way it is, with Sun Tzu and Clausewitz, a lot of people think they know what Boyd said or what his arguments were, and they like to throw darts at what they think the weak points are, but that's not what he said, right? And it's either through a third or fourth or fifth party, or everybody quotes Clausewitz, right? But nobody actually reads him. Well, a lot of people quote Boyd, but they haven't gone into the first, the primary source material to see what it is he actually said. So the press really helped, I think, fix that gap as much as we could in one book.
Well, and I think it's also interesting you point out that the archives our Marine Corps archives at the History Division here at MCU have the Boyd archival material. And it's, I think, an illustration of our archives here at History Division at the university have they're an incredible resource for military historians that oftentimes go untapped. And so that's incredible that you were able to access them and pull that information, pull that knowledge out of the filing system, the physical filing system that we've got in the archives. We're working on having our archives digitized, and we are so excited for the opportunity another year or two from now to make those available to researchers who aren't able to physically come to Quantico. But if you can't physically come to Quantico, there's a whole lot of information that is valuable and meaningful to telling the story of the Marine Corps, and now also, as you suggest, an Air Force theorist who has deeply informed Marine Corps thinking and doctrine. Last paid advertisement that I'll make for the press, and then we're going to jump into the content of your book. I assume that several of our listeners will not have yet read your book when they hear this episode. My hope is they'll be inspired from our conversation to get your book and to read it. And the advertisement for the press is, it is an actual university press accredited by the Association of University Presses, but it is also a federal entity, and so all of its publications are available free of charge. So you can get Ian's book and read it without it costing you a penny. Just go to the press's website, and you can either access, I believe, a digital version on the website, or you can contact them and they'll mail you a physical hard copy. So there is no excuse for any listener not to actually read the book. But as we start this discussion, Ian, can you very briefly lay out your main argument or the thesis that you pursued as part of this project?
Yeah, sure thing, ma'am. So the core of the book was trying to explain like the whole story of Boyd's influence on the Marine Corps, why the Marine Corps was receptive at the time to ideas like Boyd's, and understanding the process of how all of these ideas and influencers that were pushing those ideas inside the Marine Corps came together into the formal doctoral pub of MCDP1, which has been, with only one variation, the capstone warfighting philosophy of the organization ever since. And then kind of as a secondary core argument, something that I sort of came to later, again, with the help of the editorial process, was it's not just a story about a military branch, but it's also almost an example of a case study of institutional innovation. And this is actually how I've talked about it a lot since the book came out to various audiences. And that, you look at it, you've got a case study for sort of grassroots bottom-up innovation, where you've got a good idea, in this case, Boyd's ideas, his theories. You also have a fertile ground where the idea can take root and grow, which in this case was that post-Vietnam Marine Corps that was, doing a lot of introspection. And then the third piece is having some, key drivers, some key people in the right places to drive that idea forward inside the receptive institution and really make it stick. So that sort of became an aftermarket argument in my book, but it's something that I think stands out as part of the story.
Great. In chapter 3, you reference a quote from Boyd that people, ideas, and hardware, in that order of importance, are critical for building an organization or fighting a war. Can you unpack that for us? What does he mean by this?
Sure. So this goes back to what was really a core argument of Boyd himself, that he sort of explained in different ways through his many different briefings, his hours and hours long briefings, but he sort of chopped it up in different perspectives, whether it was military history, strategic competition, command and control models, or many other things. But it goes back to the core idea that of human survival as competition. And it's something that he first explored in one of the few things that he actually wrote that's sort of a coherent document, which was an essay called Destruction and Creation. And in this essay, he develops a theoretical model for how humans view the world around them, in that they try to survive by ensuring their own personal freedom of action to do things the way they want. I want to do me kind of thing. And how that desire to survive on your own terms naturally brings you into conflict with other people and groups who might have some different ideas about surviving on their own terms. And when those conflicts can't be resolved peacefully, that's when you go to armed conflict. And the point of all this was that competition is fundamentally driven by human beings. It's a human process, all of whom are making decisions to ensure their own survival and keep their competitors from infringing on that freedom. And so the human person, whether it's an individual or an entire society, is always at the heart of the problem. And that's what Boyd is trying to emphasize, that you can't lose sight of this by thinking, whether it's war or competition or, today, great power competition, it's not about the next bright idea, like an operating concept or a national strategy. It's not about the latest shiny piece of technology. It's always about influencing the behavior of your competitor. And bright ideas and shiny things can all be vectors through which you attempt to gain an advantage in that competition. But there's always a human being at the end of that technology chain who you're trying to impact. And you can't lose sight of that. And that's kind of what he was getting at there.
Okay, and that's an interesting thing for us to think about in the contemporary context as we look at influence campaigns, information environment, and this sometimes synergy, sometimes friction between material understanding of warfare and what is a less material, more of a cognitive dimension of warfare. That's a really interesting idea for us to parse out. They're the individual interests and motivations and beliefs. There are the ideas around what is effective and what isn't. And we see this, in World War I, shifting into World War II, where people think there's a cult of the offensive when actually the defense has the advantage in World War I, and we end up with trench warfare. So there's this disconnect between the actual reality of warfare and people's ideas or understanding about what warfare should be like. And then, as you suggest, the material capability or the resources, maybe, and I might be projecting onto Boyd here, in terms of military hardware, but also economic capacity, right? And the fungibility between economic strength and military capacity. Yes,
ma'am. And in fact, he kind of near the back end of his longest brief, he goes more into not necessarily specific economic, but sort of more, what we would call whole of government today. Didn't necessarily call it that back in his time, but there's different levers and different aspects of how to compete, how to influence, and how to gain that advantage over your competitor. And he, it's not that the technology, or if it's an economic lever or a military lever or what have you, it's not that it's irrelevant. It's just understanding that it's not an end in itself. The objective is always a, competition with another group of humans who have their own levers, their own shiny objects or bright ideas. And you have to understand, your competitors' human motivations, their human decision-making processes, they're human drivers in order to make your levers advantageous to you and their levers less advantageous to them.
So let's lay this on top of theories of warfighting. So in the book, you tease out Boyd's idea that people who use Clausewitz as their only filter to look at a problem, that they're stuck in the 19th century, that their thinking hasn't moved beyond 1832. This seems like an illustration of Boyd's point that it's people, and then ideas are kind of a layer on top of that, and Clausewitzian thinking is an idea, right? It's one of those layers on top of individual motivations and interests. So, as you have pointed out, and anyone who has spent more than a couple of weeks with the Marine Corps is aware, there is this cult of John Boyd in the Marine Corps too. And so how does the Marine Corps prevent this same weakness from developing through its... And I love me, General Gray. So please, General Gray, if you hear this, I love you so much. But the Marine Corps has this unwavering commitment to maneuver warfare, right? We have this unwavering commitment to the OODA loop, to Boyd's conception of the OODA loop. Are these ideas that might be distracting us from the real motivation and intention and real focus where we should be spending our time and attention?
Yeah, so that's an absolutely fair question for an institution to grapple with. And there's actually been a lot written recently over the last couple of years, even in Marine Corps Gazette and elsewhere, that's specifically argued that maneuver warfare, it's insufficient or obsolete to the challenges of the 21st century. But, kind of to your point, and even back to General Gray and some of the other folks there, is that for those who understood not the tweet version of John Boyd or in maneuver warfare, but the deeper underlying framework that's there, for starters, they would understand that, like, going back to Boyd himself, he'd be the first one to tell you that you have to constantly change and update the filters through which you view the world to maintain your advantage in that area of human competition that we just talked about. He himself was never one about locking himself into one idea. And in fact, there's an anecdote from John Schmidt, who was the author of the original FMFM1, Warfighting, under General Gray. And then he did the lion's share of the revisions for MCDP1. That kind of gets to that attitude of Boyd, which was that almost immediately after General Gray signed FMFM1, Boyd called Schmidt up to basically say, like, hey, what you wrote in Warfighting is great, but now you've got to change this, and this in it. Like, the ink isn't even dry on the thing. And Boyd's already looking at how to adapt and upgrade it, based on new information. And that's kind of in line with what General Krulak wrote in his own introduction in MCDP1 when it turned from the FMFM to the MCDP. They specifically say doctrine can't be stagnant. It doesn't stand still, and because the world doesn't stand still. And so, I think Boyd and some of those folks who had the deeper understanding of the fullness of the concept and the doctrine would 100% say that you're definitely guilty of blinding yourself by locking yourself, into this golden age of thinking it's 1989 or 1997, as guilty as you would be about saying Clausewitz got everything right in 1832. We don't need to explore war any further. We just need to do Clausewitz better. And so I think before we look at adapting and moving beyond, we have to understand the fullness of the concepts that drove maneuver warfare the first time around. And so, before you start adjusting your mental model, which you should do, which, Boyd and all the others would say you have to do, you have to understand what's in that model to make sure your adjustment doesn't get rid of something valuable. The goal of my book is not to say that we should lock ourselves into this, this great story from the 80s and 90s. We just do this more and better, and we'll be fine. But before we can move on, we need to understand the fullness of the story. And that's kind of what I tried to get at in the book, is like, we'll give you the big picture as best we understand it. Now you've got the background to inform future adjustments and changes. And I'll toot my own horn here for a second and something else. But in 2016, I wrote an article for the Gazette that specifically said, we got to update warfighting. The article was called Warfighting 3.0. And it was like, chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, these are Major Brown's recommendations on what we would change to adapt it to 21st century challenges. Certain things that exist now that did not exist back then, especially, the information in the digital age. 1997, when MCDP1 was revised, that stuff was in sort of very nascent form, just sort of coming online. Now we're immersed in it. So it's totally fair to say we should maybe speak to this aspect of it. But my other goal with that article on adjusting it was grounding it within the consistency of the intellectual framework that's come before. because if you understand the fullness of that framework, there's actually a lot that's already there. There's stuff that Boyd talked about that is 100% applicable to, the information world we live in today. But that's not the stuff that was taught down kind of through the ages, from 1989. That stuff, read the book, you can kind of find out why some of that stuff fell by the wayside, but it did. And so we can definitely look forward, but before we jump off, there's stuff still in that bedrock of maneuver warfare that is useful. So we need to understand all of it before we start looking at what we're cutting away from the edges and what we're going to slap onto it.
I think that's really useful. In the book, you focus on the post-Vietnam era as, I don't want to call it a watershed because I don't want to make it too dramatic, but as an important moment in the birth of maneuver warfare. And that toward the end or at the end of the Vietnam War, the Marine Corps faced this question of what was the Corps to do? How was the Corps to do it? And maneuver warfare was the answer to those questions, and an effective answer for the time. We've seen a lot with force design. We've seen a lot, the new Global Trends 2040 just came out last month and paints a not so rosy picture of the next 2 decades of our collective lives. So in 2021, I'm going to ask you that question. What is the Marine Corps to do? How is the Marine Corps to do it? Are there lessons from your book that can help inform this thinking?
I absolutely think so. And I'll preface and say this may wind up being a long-winded answer, but I hope it's coherent. But to call the end of Vietnam a watershed, I think it's fair. And in fact, the image I usually use in my presentation on the subject is that helicopter taking off the embassy in Saigon with people trying to get on board it. That right there kind of, it speaks to a very visceral level of the consequences of failure, of running away. We left for our own reasons, right? But we left without what we considered the job being finished. And we had a whole bunch of people who were begging to come out with us. And that forced a lot of very hard questions about how that image happened. And it wasn't just the Marine Corps, all the armed forces were looking at it in the United States. But the Marines who came out of it at the time believed that those were 2 very serious questions. What is the Corps? What do we do? And how do we do it? And they believed that they owed some serious thought and serious answers to that question, to their own Marines as well as to the American public, who are the ones they're ultimately responsible to. So I hope you don't think this is kind of a cop-out answer, but I think the same cultural answer that I get at in the book is still the right answer for the Marine Corps today. And that cultural answer is it's not a doctrine, it's not a table of organization, but it's an attitude that historically, culturally seems to be hardwired into the Marine Corps, which is that it's inherently an adapted organization whose relevancy has come from the ability to look at the challenges around it and change itself as required to meet those challenges. And I spend a little time on this in the book because, those questions coming out of Vietnam, the challenge was, what's the utility of an amphibious force in the late Cold War when the big threat is Soviet tanks coming through the Fulda Gap, and there didn't seem to be much the Marine Corps could offer in that particular scenario. And there was also kind of a fixation on that amphibious piece, even this idea that the Marines only exist to do Iwo Jima over and over again, which loses sight of the fact that historically the Marine Corps has done a ton more than just Iwo Jimas or what we call forcible entry today. And I spent a little time getting into that because I think it's very important to show that change over time. The amphibious warfare piece, for example, it wasn't even the Corps' primary mission until after World War II. And, the Corps had been around for over 150 years at that point. And then even after World War II, which is what that golden age of, amphibious warfare that everybody kind of looks back to, the National Security Act of 1947 gave the Corps 11 different specified or implied missions beyond forcible entry. And so throughout that spectrum of its history, the thing that is true, and it sounds kind of trite, but I think it's true and the evidence bears it out, is that it's about being adapted and ready. It's not simply the readiness in terms of how quick can we throw our stuff on a ship and get to the crisis point, but it's that readiness for the most likely challenges in the world around you. And those challenges will constantly change. And so your readiness requires an institutional adaptability that allows you to change your specific mission without losing your institutional identity along the way. And this gets back to the issue of today. What is the Corps to do today and how are we going to do it? And I think we have to understand the history because I think today the Corps is still, what do? We are that forward-looking first responder. We're ready to be the first ones in for whatever the challenge of today or tomorrow is. And how we do this is by having the institutional flexibility to change ourselves radically, if necessary, to confront that challenge. And speaking for myself here, and I'm not trying to paint a broad brush to some of the critiques that have come out regarding some of the, the changes to force design and structure and all that's come out. But I think it's a lack of total appreciation of that historical flexibility across the centuries we've existed that drives a little, some of those critiques. It's not understanding who we are as an institution, because the core, if you're upset that we're divesting this or that weapon system, or we're reorganizing the table of organization for this type of unit, the core is not defined by a weapon system. We're not defined by, a specific mission. Like I said, we've had dozens and dozens of missions assigned over time. We're not defined by our table of organization or an operating concept. What I think really defines us is our flexibility to change weapon systems or embrace new missions or embrace new tables of organization, because that's what the threat of the day requires. And because that institutional flexibility lies in the minds and attitude of our people, this goes back to that people, ideas, things perspective of Boyd, almost without being conscious of it. And that's another point I tried to make in the book, is that part of why Boyd's ideas were attractive was because that hierarchy of a priority and that ability to change and adapt yourself to stay competitive was something that in an almost unconscious fashion was baked into the hardwired, operating system of the Marine Corps. And it's just Boyd put that attitude into words and kind of gave it an intellectual framework that provided some more rigor to something that was already going on. So that was a very long answer to the question, but I hope it answered it.
No, I think it was a good answer to the question. As you were giving that answer, I was thinking, and I don't recall seeing this in the book, so correct me if I missed it, but one of the things that I find intellectually interesting and professionally frustrating about force design is that we're having it in the broader context of economic constriction, in the sense that resources are scarce. We are a year into the pandemic, and the economy is doing far better, I think, than most of us would have predicted a year ago. But we are seeing budgets tighten and resources being less available in this fiscal year than they were last fiscal year, than they were the year before. And we anticipate that scarcity is going to continue moving forward. So is Boyd grappling with these broader socioeconomic constraints and how that might shape? How would you recommend the Marine Corps grapple with those broader socioeconomic constraints and how that might shape us as we move forward with force design? Because it's just a reality, right? We can't get out of it. It's just the reality of the world we're living in right now.
I don't think Boyd is quite as specific on those aspects of it, but that's something where I don't go into a huge amount of detail in the book, but I know kind of the history behind it, but it's a place where the Marine Corps has been before. Mm-hmm. And I go back and starting even that window between World War II and Korea, if we want to simply talk about tables of organization and thinking about your force structure in a resource constrained environment, like World War II, like the U.S. does after almost all of its wars, like it draws down, like it sends everybody's home, because the standing military is not our thing, right? At least until kind of we realize after Korea that we sort of needed that. But in that window, the Marine Corps is also looking at the challenge of warfare on a nuclear battlefield. That was the new big thing. I'd have to find the resources. I don't remember their titles, but I've read a number of very good things that talk about how in that window, when like the Corps is being drawn down from like its, I don't know, it had 6 or 7 land divisions, massive aviation elements, it grew hugely, and then it drew down even just as radically. But inside of that, they were changing and adapting. There were at least 2 or 3 significant changes to the tables of organization and equipment inside the Marine Corps in that window between World War II and Korea to try and get it ready for the nuclear battlefield. And this is also where the rotary wing aviation, the helicopters, very slowly starting to come online. And the Marine Corps didn't have really large numbers or even more than a couple of helicopters, but they were still looking at how to use it, how to organize themselves without having all the stuff. Right. I think the last table of organization change happened really right before the Korean War broke out, but they had gone through several different iterations without the money to fill all the slots in the TO&E in there, but they were still tinkering and changing and adapting with it. And they were still looking forward at, we don't have it, more than 1 or 2 helicopters. There's the one general, Krulak is hanging down from in Quantico, and maybe there's 1 or 2 others. Right. But they were looking at how, if they had those things, they could make them work, so that when Korea broke out and they had to start filling all those holes in the TO&E and building out helicopter squadrons, the ideas were there. And honestly, that's really just, it's another echo of what the Corps did between World War I and World War II, which I think we all know the story of. Nobody had landing craft, nobody had massive numbers of tanks or large numbers of aviation, but the amphibious warfare construct and concept was done in that resource constrained environment. So I think honestly, like, we do some of our best work in that resource constrained environment, because it almost takes us off of like chasing the shiny object or the laser dot on the floor, and focuses to really sort of close our eyes and use our imagination about what we can do with different things, rather than focusing on, one or two shiny things that are right in front of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and again, I am no economist and I am no historian, but I also think this period at the end of the Vietnam War, as our understanding of maneuver warfare, General Gray's understanding of maneuver warfare, was solidifying and becoming Marine Corps doctrine. This was a period of economic hardship in the United States as well, right? A serious inflationary pressure through the United States, some economic conscription. You guys remember gas prices were through the roof. I was a little bitty baby, so I actually don't remember, but I have heard tell that was true. So it gives further credence to your point that these periods of, it's hard to say scarcity because we still are a country of abundance and wealth, but those periods of contraction can actually foster some really profoundly important innovation.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, man. I forget who said the quote, but it's, we're out of money now, it's time to think. Mm-hmm. I think really captures that, because it's almost liberating, because you're not forcing yourself to find gainful employment for all these things you have, the shiny objects or what have you. You can imagine what if on kind of a blank slate, when you're not tied into one thing that you feel like you have to use to justify its continued existence or its funding, for example.
Mm-hmm. So what surprised you when you were working on this book, other than the fact that the Boyd collection is in the Marine Corps archives, not the Air Force archives?
Yes. So I knew a little bit about that. I was still impressed at the depth of the collection. So there are a couple of things, kind of in that vein. And as I mentioned above, like when I first started this, I knew Boyd from the OODA loop and, from a little reference in MCDP1. And one thing I was surprised at was, and the archives really show this, was the depth of the well of his ideas. And then came a corollary as I kept going, was that a lot of the critiques, both of his ideas and of, the maneuver warfare as a warfighting philosophy, have not grappled with those ideas as they were written, as they were developed. I think I mentioned before, I think lots of people are kind of whacking at a straw man when they come critiquing Boyd and some of his ideas. And it's not that no military thinker is beyond criticism. Everyone's got strengths and weaknesses. Clausewitz has strengths and weaknesses. Sun Tzu has strengths and weaknesses. But as I went through the archival material and I started to see the depth of this well, it just it bothered me that a lot of these conceptions people have of his ideas, the tweet version of it, they're wrong. I've people arguing that the OODA loop it's a closed, simple 4-step process. They're wrong. If they think that is the core of his ideas, right? Like Boyd equals the OODA loop, everything else is just footnotes. That's wrong too. In fact, it was about a month ago over at the strategy and policy course at the MAGTF instructional group. I gave my brief to the students there, and without even realizing it, I spent an hour talking about Boyd's ideas and their impact on the Marine Corps. I didn't mention the OODA loop once, because you almost don't have to, because it is not the core engine driving his ideas. In fact, the history of the OODA loop is he didn't even sort of put it into a visual depiction until close to the end of his life. He talks about it a bunch of times. It doesn't really explain it, but he spends the 8-hour brief he gave to the Marines, time and time again. It's mentioned in passing once or twice. There are many other things he talks about very extensively, and the OODA loop is not one of them. So it is not vital. And that goes back to, and there's a bunch of misconceptions about the loop itself. Like it was just came from air to air tactics. That's wrong. I can prove that documentarily. It's wrong. If, thinking that Boyd only applies to that sort of more conventional tank on tank warfare, it doesn't apply to insurgencies, or as we talked about, it doesn't apply to information warfare today. It's 100% wrong. In fact, there a lot of the stuff that I was not really able to get into the book and delve into, but which is in his presentations, is looking at environments where narrative and influence and messaging and setting an example of behavior versus your actual actions. And this applies to a country as much as it does to organizations and individuals. These things that we're talking about now in the realm of great power competition and information warfare, it's all there. It's just not easily accessible. And so that's surprising. I tried to do my best inside of one book to address some of those things and bring out some of those things to show that there's just so much more there than there really is. What I would just hope out of all that is that for those who, again, nobody's beyond critique. No idea is perfect, but you owe it to the integrity of the discussion to be engaging with the ideas as they actually are, not as what somebody else has written for clickbait. I'd say there's a lot more in there to be explored and discovered. So if you want to get in there and really wrestle with and grapple with the strengths and weaknesses, it's there, but just go look at what he said. I did my best to shine some light on this stuff, but I'm not saying my interpretation is perfect either. Go look at what he said and what he wrote, because it's there.
So our last question for you, what are you reading right now that our listeners should know about?
So on the topic of Boyd, I've actually got I was asked by the Swedish Defense University to do a lecture on how Boyd's ideas could impact air power doctrine for smaller state air forces that are facing stronger neighbors. And so I'm using the Winter War of 1940 as one of my sort of examples of that, of the Soviet Union invading Finland with its much smaller forces. So I have a bunch of titles about the Winter War on my desk that I'm going through. One is Vesa Nenye's Finland at War, William Trotter's Frozen Hell, and Carl Friedrich Geust's Red Wings in the Winter War. I had never read anything about the Winter War, but now I'm learning. So that's what I'm reading.
Fascinating. I look forward to getting the Cliff Notes version when you're done with that. That sounds really interesting. So Major Brown, thank you so much for coming on the show. To keep up with the good work of Marine Corps University, follow us on social media at Marine Corps U. Special thanks to our intrepid producer, Jen Patcha Howell, and our show manager, Captain Michael Goff. And congratulations, Captain Goff, on your promotion. I'm your host, Becky Johnson. Thank you for listening to Eagles, Globes, and Anchors, the strategically minded, innovative podcast of Marine Corps University.